In 1932, along the Ohio River, a man crouches over a fire. His jacket is torn. His shoes are tied with rope. A tin can boils between two bricks. He is not a failure. He is a carpenter, 14 months without work. He rode a freight train chasing a job that didn't exist. But he knows how to survive. He knows fire, safe berries. That cornmeal and water can become enough. By 1932, millions were riding the rails. Carpenters, miners, veterans, living in camps they called jungles. And in those jungles, they cooked. Not scraps. A real food culture built on skill, knowledge, and necessity. Here's what history forgot. They weren't the problem. They were the solution. These are 30 meals they actually cooked. Number 30. Mulligan Stew. Every jungle had a pot. Not every man's pot, the jungle's pot. A large tin over the fire all day. You put in what you had. A man arriving with potatoes contributed them. Someone had begged a soup bone from a farmhouse. Someone had foraged wild onions from the creek bank. Dried beans soaked overnight. All of it went in. By evening, what came out was more than the sum of its parts. The potatoes had thickened the broth. The bone had given everything it had. The onions had gone soft and sweet. Mulligan Stew had no recipe. It had a philosophy. You gave what you had. You took what you needed. You left something in the pot for the man who arrived after dark. In the hobo jungles of the 1930s, that was not charity. That was civilization. Number 29. Acorn Mush. The oak groves along the California rail lines dropped acorns every autumn by the bushel, free for the taking. The problem was, the tannins raw acorns are bitter to the point of inedibility. California hobo camps of the early 1930s included men who had learned acorn processing from indigenous communities near the rail lines, Miwok and Yokuts, people who had relied on acorns as a staple for 10,000 years. The knowledge moved through the proximity of shared poverty and the willingness to learn from anyone who knew something you didn't. Crack the shells, grind the meat, soak in repeated changes of creek water until the bitterness is gone, boil into thick mush. Acorn flour sells for $18 a pound at specialty grocers today. The knowledge of how to make it traveled from ancient indigenous food culture into Depression-era hobo camps and then disappeared, replaced by shame, by brand names, by the insistence that real food came in a package. That is not progress. That is the theft of 10,000 years of human knowledge. Number 28. Hobo bread. No oven. That was the problem every camp cook faced. No oven, no pan, nothing that could hold even heat. Just a fire and whatever tins the camp had accumulated. The solution was the can itself, flour, water, salt, a pinch of baking soda when they had it. Mixed in the can, sealed with cloth tied down with wire, set directly in the coals, not over the fire, in it for 40 minutes, then tapped out onto a hand. Dense, dark on the outside, soft enough inside that a hungry man could close his eyes. Today we call it no-knead artisan bread and sell it at farmers' markets for $9 a loaf. The men who invented it are buried in unmarked graves along the rail lines. Nobody is giving them credit for anything. Number 27. Cornmeal mush with sorghum. The reliable one. Always possible if a man had anything at all. Cornmeal at 3 cents a pound. Sorghum syrup at 10 cents a quart that lasted long enough to sweeten 100 meals. Boiling water, cornmeal stirred in slowly, cooked 20 minutes until thick, poured into a flat tin, and left to cool overnight. This is where the genius was. The cooled mush became firm, sliceable. The next morning those slices went into hot lard and fried until golden and slightly caramelized at the edges where the sorghum had mixed in. Crisp enough to shatter. 2 meals from one cooking. 1 fire. 1 handful of cornmeal. Nothing wasted, not one spoonful. That is not poverty logic. That is a level of food understanding that the modern kitchen, with its abundance and its waste, has almost entirely lost. Number 26. Dandelion green salad with bacon grease dressing. The roadsides of Ohio and Indiana in spring were full of food. Most people drove past it. Hobo camp cooks stopped and picked it. Young dandelion greens, pulled before the flower opened, still tender, gathered from field edges and creek banks, washed in creek water, piled into a tin. Bacon grease heated until it shimmered, poured directly over the greens. The bitterness softened. The greens wilted at the edges into something bright and sharp and alive. Modern nutritional analysis shows dandelion greens contain more beta-carotene than carrots, more calcium per serving than milk. The men eating them in Indiana in 1934 knew this not because they had read a nutrition label, but because they felt better when they ate them. They knew things about wild food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 25. Railroad gravy on stale bread. Do not mistake this for an accident. A cup of flour browned in a dry tin until it turned the color of hazelnuts. Then water or weak coffee, or yesterday's pot liquid added slowly, stirred constantly. Salt, black pepper if the camp had it. Over stale bread begged from bakeries at closing time. The gravy softened the bread. The bread thickened the gravy. Together they became something with a name in every rail yard camp from Georgia to Washington State. Railroad gravy. Named with directness and the refusal of shame that ran through everything these men made, a cup of flour cost less than 1 cent in 1933. That is not desperation. That is genius. Number 24. Fried fatback strips. Fatback cost 5 cents a pound in 1934. Pure fat, salted, sold in slabs. Most grocery customers walked past it. Hobo camp cooks in the Appalachian rail camps knew exactly what it was. Oil, flavor, protein, and cooking medium, all in one 5-cent slab. Sliced thin, laid in a hot tin. A sound like paper tearing, then a slow, steady sizzle. Then the smell of hot pork fat filling the space under the bridge, the strips crisped and curled. Eaten alone, on bread, crumbled into beans. The grease left in the tin became the cooking fat for the next 3 meals. Today, a restaurant in Nashville puts pork belly on a plate with a microgreen and charges $24. Same animal, same fat, same cut. The only thing missing is the truth about where the idea came from. Number 23. Foraged mushroom fry. The forests along the Pacific Northwest rail lines were full of chanterelles in October, oyster mushrooms on fallen logs, porcini in the Douglas fir stands. The hobo cooks who worked those camps knew which ones to pick, not from a book, but from oral knowledge passed man to man along the rail lines like a living field guide. This was oral mycology, a field guide with no pages, maintained by men with no permanent address, but a precise understanding of what grew where and how to tell a chanterelle from a jack-o'-lantern mushroom by the color of the gills. Fried in whatever fat the camp had. Salt, nothing else needed. The smell had no business existing under a bridge in Oregon in 1935. It smelled like something you would pay for. It got a tin can and a fire, and men who knew exactly how good it was. Number 22. Tin can tomato soup. Dented cans of tomatoes went for a penny at grocery back doors in Pittsburgh and Baltimore and Newark. The can went directly into the fire until it swelled and hissed, then pulled out, opened carefully, diluted with water in a larger tin. Salt, a scrap of onion, whatever the camp had. Hot tomato soup. On the bank of the Allegheny River in January of 1932, that was the difference between sleeping with something warm in your belly and not sleeping at all. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Campbell's condensed tomato soup retailed for 10 cents a can in 1930, a full day's food budget for a camp cook. The same company was donating dented surplus stock to grocer backdoor economies, not out of generosity, but to avoid disposal costs. The men under the bridges were eating Campbell's charity and Campbell's profit margin simultaneously. Number 21. Hobo oatmeal. Rolled oats cost 5 cents a pound. A pound of oats and a tin of water over a fire for 15 minutes produced breakfast for 3 men. Let that math land slowly. Cooked in whatever tin was available, water from the railroad pump or the creek, stirred with a stick, covered with cloth to hold the steam. Sometimes wild berries stirred in at the end, blackberries, service berries, tiny wild strawberries from the rail bed in June. They bled purple into the oats and sweetened them without sugar. Rolled oats release glucose slowly. They sustain energy for 4 to 6 hours. The men eating oatmeal from tin cans were fueled better for a morning of moving and surviving than office workers eating processed white toast in the cities they were passing through. Nobody told them that. They already knew. Number 20. Crackling cornbread. Cornmeal at 3 cents a pound. Pork cracklings collected from farmhouse back doors, the small crisp pieces left after rendering lard, tucked into coat pockets and carried into camp like treasure. Mixed directly into the batter, fried in a skillet lid, or baked in a covered tin in the coals. The cracklings melted partially into the batter, left pockets of fat that kept the interior moist. The crust made a sound when you broke it a crack, a shattering that meant something was actually good. A southern gastropub today sells artisan crackling cornbread for $11 a square on a small wooden board with whipped butter. He made it for 3 cents in the dirt in Mississippi in 1934. Nobody called it artisan anything. Number 19. Boiled peanuts. Raw peanuts begged from Georgia and South Carolina farms for 2 cents a pound, sometimes free, gleaned from field edges after harvest. Boiled in salted water for 3 hours until the shells softened, and the peanuts inside turned creamy and dense and completely different from anything raw or roasted. The boiling pulled salt through the shell into the nut itself. It made them silky, yielding, rich in a way that made a man slow down and eat one at a time, because there was pleasure in it. And pleasure was not something to rush through when you didn't know where the next meal was coming from. They are still sold at roadside stands across Georgia today. Same recipe: water, salt, peanuts, thyme, $5 a bag. The recipe has not changed in 90 years. The people who get credit for it have. Number 18. Hobo steak. Flour, water, salt mixed into dough, patted flat, fried in a tin lid until golden on both sides and puffed at the edges. That was hobo steak. A piece of fried bread roughly the size and shape of a piece of meat, named with full irony and zero shame. They named it themselves. That is the part that matters. It is the philosophy of men stripped of everything the world used to measure a person's worth, job, house, money, status, who refused to stop finding humor in their situation, who named their fried dough after the one thing they couldn't have and ate it with complete satisfaction. This was not poverty food pretending to be something else. This was men refusing to let poverty be the whole story. Number 17. Wild onion and potato soup. Kansas and Oklahoma in 1934, the center of the Dust Bowl. Men who had farmed that land for 20 years watched it turn to dust, then climbed onto freight trains with nothing. But they knew the land. They knew where wild onions grew along creek beds even in drought years. They knew which fields had left potatoes in the ground after a failed harvest, small ones, missed by the plow, still there if you were willing to get on your knees and dig. They dug. Boiled both in a tin with water, salt, black pepper, whatever the camp had. The soup came out pale gold. It smelled like the farms these men had lost. They ate it without speaking much. Some things don't require commentary. Number 16. Chicory root stew. Chicory grew along every roadside in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, a weed with blue flowers that nobody with a house paid attention to. Hobo camp cooks paid very close attention. The root dug up, cleaned, chopped, and boiled with foraged onion, salt pork scraps, water, cornmeal for thickening. The bitterness softened with long cooking into something complex and nutty. Eaten hot from the tin, it was a meal. Left overnight and sliced cold, it was something you could pick up with your hands. Chicory root contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber, and compounds that support liver function under stress. Men eating chicory stew in 1935 were protecting themselves at the cellular level without knowing the science. They knew things about that plant that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 15. Grease bread. Lard at 4 cents a pound. In the Appalachian camps and mid-Atlantic hobo jungles, grease bread was the emergency meal when the mulligan pot was empty and the beans were gone and there was nothing but flour and a tin with lard in the bottom. Dough dropped in spoonfuls into hot lard, puffed, blistered at the edges, slightly doughy at the center. Eaten hot, burning your fingers because you had been cooking since before sunrise and you had earned something at its best. This is the direct ancestor of funnel cake, of fry bread, of every piece of fried dough at every state fair in America. They charge $8 for funnel cake at the Ohio State Fair. Nobody charges anything for the hobo camp version because the men who invented it didn't have a fair. They had 4 cents worth of lard and a fire. That is not progress. That is erasure dressed up as a funnel cake. Number 14. Salvation Army bean soup. The Salvation Army soup lines in Chicago and Detroit opened at 6 in the morning and emptied before 7 by 1932. Men who arrived at 7:15 got nothing. The men who got nothing went back to camp and reconstructed it. They had stood in line. They had watched through the kitchen window. They had smelled the navy beans, the onion, the ghost of ham bone. Navy beans soaked overnight, foraged onion, salt, a pork rind that still had something left to give, boiled 3 hours, mashed partially against the tin to thicken the broth. Not the same as the Salvation Army soup. Close enough. And more than that, made by their own hands, in their own camp, for men who were hungry and did not intend to stay that way. That is not desperation. That is culinary intelligence. Grandma just called it figuring it out. Number 13. Jungle coffee. Real coffee cost a nickel a cup in 1932. Unaffordable. So they roasted grain, wheat, berries, barley, rye, whatever the field edges gave up. Dry roasted in a tin lid until it turned dark and smelled almost like the real thing. Boiled hard in a can of creek water, poured through a piece of cloth. It was bitter, it was dark, it was hot. On a cold November morning under a bridge in Illinois, it was everything. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Chicory root, which many camps used, growing free along roadsides, contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber the supplement industry now charges $40 a bottle to replicate. Grandma just called it making do. She was right. Number 12. Tin can baked beans. Navy beans at 4 cents a pound. Soaked overnight, packed into a tin with salt pork, a spoonful of sorghum, a pinch of dry mustard, enough water to cover. The tin sealed and buried in the coals of the morning fire, not over the fire in it. Left 8 hours while the camp went about its day. At dusk, someone dug up the can. Actual baked beans, slow cooked, deeply flavored, the pork dissolved into the liquid, the beans creamy at the center. The same baked beans Boston restaurants sold for 25 cents a bowl in 1932. Same beans, same low heat, same salt pork and sweetener. The only difference was the oven, and the men under the bridge had figured out that the earth itself, packed around a sealed tin, was an oven that cost nothing and worked every time. Number 10. Hobo pie. 2 pieces of bread. Whatever filling the camp had a scraping of lard and sugar, leftover berry mash, a few pressed beans, a piece of salt pork. crimped together at the edges and held over the fire or set on a flat stone beside the coals until both sides went golden and the filling was hot inside. In the Midwest hobo jungles of the 1930s, hobo pie was celebration food. You made it when something good had happened, a day's work found, the mulligan pot particularly good, someone arriving with something unexpected. Today, a cast-iron mountain pie maker sells on Amazon for $35 with a recipe booklet. The product description does not mention where the idea came from. It does not mention the men who made the same thing with 2 rocks and a stick under a bridge in Michigan in 1936. Mentioning them would require giving them credit. Number 9. Mulligan beans. A pound of dried pinto beans cost 4 cents in 1933. Soaked overnight, boiled 3 hours with a 2-cent piece of salt pork that fed 4 men for 2 full days. That is the math of survival done by men who had nothing else to do on a freight car but calculate exactly how far their last 4 cents could take them. The beans cooked low and slow, the salt pork dissolving into them. By the 3rd hour, the camp smelled like something a man's grandmother would have made on a Sunday. The beans went creamy at the edges, the broth thickened to something between soup and gravy. This was not a lesser version of a better meal. This was the meal. Number 8. Salt cod and hardtack. Salt cod at 6 cents a pound, a sailor's food that found its way into northeastern hobo camps from Boston to Baltimore because it lasted and because the men there often knew what it was. Soaked overnight in cold creek water, the salt drawn out slowly until it was fish again. Hardtack baked in camp flour, water, salt, rolled flat, pierced with a nail, baked on a stone until bone dry and hard enough to last a week. Not good. Not meant to be good. Meant to last. But when the rehydrated cod simmered in a tin with creek water, foraged onion, and boiled potato, and the hardtack went in to soften in the broth, it became something. The hardtack absorbed everything and softened like a dumpling. The cod broke into white flakes. It was good the way a thing is good when it is exactly what the situation requires and the person making it knew what they were doing. Number 7. Fried cornmeal cakes. Cornmeal, water, salt. Complete ingredient list. Nothing else. Batter dropped by the spoonful into a lard-greased tin lid. Listened to, because sound was how you cooked, without a timer. The sizzle when the batter hit told you the fat was ready. The change in the sizzle from wet and bubbling to dry and crackling told you to flip. Both sides the color of old wood, edges crisp enough to shatter, eaten hot, standing up, burning your fingers. Because a man who has been cooking over a fire since before sunrise has earned the right to eat something at its best. Today, a brunch restaurant puts hoe cakes on the menu for $12 with local honey and cultured butter. The recipe is identical. The credit goes nowhere near the men who ate them standing beside a fire in Georgia in 1936. Number 6. Hobo hash. Potatoes at 2 cents a pound in 1933. 2 pounds and 1 foraged onion, a meal for 3 men that left the pan smelling like something good had happened in it. Diced rough, the onion sliced thin, both into the hot lard tin together, pressed flat, and left completely alone for 5 minutes while the bottom layer built a golden crust. Then turned in sections, not stirred, turned the crust coming up, the pale potato going down against the fat, pressed flat again, left alone again. Hash with a crust on both sides, soft interior, caramelized onion running through it. This is the direct ancestor of every hash brown on every diner menu in America, every roadside breakfast plate, every truck stop special. The technique traveled from hobo camp to diner kitchen to national breakfast culture without a single attribution. That is not progress, that is amnesia with a side of home fries. Number 5. Turnip and fatback boil. After the commercial harvest in October and November, the small and damaged turnips stayed in the fields of Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. The hobo camp cooks who worked those rail lines knew which farms planted turnips. They kept this knowledge like a planting calendar, mentally, precisely, seasonally. They were farming without land. The turnips boiled in a tin with fatback and water for an hour until completely soft, and the fatback had given everything to the broth. Salt, black pepper. The broth after the solids were eaten was not discarded. It became the cooking liquid for the next day's cornmeal. The minerals and fat and faint sweetness of turnip dissolved into it and became part of the next meal. Nothing stopped, nothing was wasted. The pot was a continuous thing, a chain of meals linked by broth and intention. Number 4. Poke salad. Pokeweed grows along fence lines and roadsides throughout the South and Appalachia, tall, dramatic, with dark berries and thick stems reaching 7 feet. The roots are toxic. The mature leaves are toxic. The berries are toxic. The young spring leaves are edible if boiled in 2 full changes of water, with both discarded. This knowledge traveled the rail lines with the precision of a safety warning, because it was a safety warning. First water out. Second water out. Never skip the second water. Never use the stems. Men passed it with the seriousness of men who understood the consequence of getting it wrong. And then they ate poke salad, nutritious, iron-rich greens that grew free along every fence line in the South. The Hobo Camp Network preserved the knowledge of poke salad preparation while housed communities were already losing it. The men who were supposed to be most disconnected from civilization were keeping a piece of it alive. That is not poverty. That is custodianship. Number 3. Tin can fish chowder. The rail lines followed the rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Columbia, the Tennessee. The men who camped along those rivers fished seriously, with the attention of men who understood that what they pulled from the water was the difference between eating and not. They knew which bends held catfish, which shallows had perch, which deep summer pools held bass that would take a bread dough ball on a bent nail hook. Fish cleaned at the bank. Into a tin with creek water, foraged onion, whatever starch the camp had, a boiled potato, a handful of cornmeal stirred in, a piece of hardtack softening in the broth. Simmered 40 minutes. The flesh broke into white flakes, and the broth became something with body and depth. This was a recipe, passed from man to man along the river camps, refined over seasons, a living cuisine with no cookbook, no chef, no restaurant, just men who had cooked fish in a tin long enough to do it well. Number 2. Bread heel pudding. The bakeries knew. By closing time, the heels had accumulated the end pieces nobody wanted. A man who showed up respectfully with a clean tin could usually leave with enough to feed a camp. Soaked overnight in water or wheat-grain coffee, pressed into a tin, compressed until dense and uniform, a spoonful of sorghum, if the camp had it, a pinch of cinnamon from a broken spice tin traded down the road. Baked in the coals 30 minutes until the top set and caramelized where the sorghum had bubbled through. Today bread pudding is a fine southern restaurant staple from New Orleans to Charleston, warm in a ceramic ramekin, bourbon sauce, $9. The base is identical. Stale bread, liquid, sweetener, heat. The technique is the same technique worked out from bakery heels and creek water in a tin buried in coals. The cream is new. The bourbon sauce is new. The $9 is new. Grandma just called it not wasting good bread. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 1. Stone soup. The jungle pot. Every man who arrived at a hobo jungle knew the story. A traveler arrives with nothing. He puts a stone in a pot of water over a fire. It just needs a potato, he says. Someone produces one. It just needs an onion. Someone produces one. By the time the soup is done, everyone has contributed something. Everyone eats. In the hobo jungles of the 1930s, it was not just a story, it was a practice. The stone went in first. Always. Not because it did anything culinary, it didn't. Because it started something. Because it said, there will be a pot, there will be a meal. Anyone with something contributes it. Anyone with nothing contributes labor or wood or willingness. Everyone eats. A potato from one coat pocket, dried beans from another. A strip of fatback from a man paid in pork scraps 2 days ago. Foraged onion. A fistful of cornmeal for thickening. Wild greens added at the end. 20 men could eat from that pot. What it produced was not just food. It was a social contract. A declaration that these men, stripped of job, house, money, every measure the world uses to value a person, still had something. Still had the capacity to care for each other. Still had the knowledge to make something from nothing. Still had the dignity to sit together around a fire and eat a meal they had made with their own hands. The food industry could not sell that. A man who knows how to make stone soup from what the creek bank and his campmates provide is a man who does not need to buy dinner. That was the problem. That was always the problem.